So could you start by saying
My name?
your name, when you were at Stevenson, your major, what drew you to Stevenson?
My name is John Leihrt. I was a student at UCSC and Stevenson College from 1968 to 1972. I lived on campus for 2 of the 4 years. And interestingly, when I showed up, there were only 4 colleges. Merrill was opening as I was entering as a student. And they went through an elaborate process for you to choose your college. Initially, you checked a box, and then when it turned out that that they couldn't allocate them correctly, they sent them out again, and we rechecked them. And then a third time, they said, you please write an essay on what college you wanted. And my essay was anything but Crown, because I didn't want to be in a science college. But Stevenson, as a social sciences college, always appealed. And frankly, I was always politically interested and had started to be politically active in the year before I came to UCSC. And the fact that it was named after Adlai Stevenson just seemed like a cool thing.
What about UCSC? What was the process applying to college?
Well, that's very interesting, because when I got there, I realized that not many people had a grade point average as low as I did. Mine was 3.4 in high school, and that was when you had the highest you could get is 4.0, and yet I was really active. I grew up in Vallejo. It was a very working class town, very racially mixed. And I ended up, my 3.4 grade point average was the highest male in my graduating high school class. And what drew me to Santa Cruz was, it was only 2 years old when I applied. There were no grades. There was the residential colleges. There was a totally different ratio of students to teachers. You were really going to get to know your professors. You were going to live with people in the college. And there were no grades, and I just thought that was the coolest thing in the universe. And I found somebody else that did the same thing I did lately, but at the time, people applied to multiple colleges, their choice. I just wanted Santa Cruz. I only applied to Santa Cruz. Didn't apply to a single other place. And in those days, you could be redirected to another UC if you weren't admitted in your first choice, so I might have done that, but I didn't understand, because there was some number, like 7 or 8 applications for every vacancy, and among the lower grade point averages of people I knew, it was a miracle I got in, and I just didn't understand rolling the dice and it being the only place I applied, that was a risk.
Had you seen UCSC or Stevenson prior to accepting?
Yes, my family came down, and somewhere in some box, I haven't seen it for years, we took slides of what the campus looked like when we came to look at it. It was probably 1966 or 67. I remember we went to Central Services, which is now Hahn Student Center. That was the administration building in the first years of the college. We parked in the lot and ate sandwiches, and we went up to where Porter College is, and took a picture down and looked down. There was nothing there. It was just a beautiful view from a ridge. And looked at the colleges that were there, and it was just very exciting. It was just the fact that it was in such a beautiful place and in the forest. And I'd been familiar with Santa Cruz growing up in the Bay Area as being this cute little beach town, and so I was just very excited by it when we came to visit. But it was right at the beginning. We probably visited in the summer after the first year of campus.
Let me just readjust this again. So what was your major at the time?
I ended up majoring in politics, but when I showed up, it was called government. It wasn't shifted to politics till my first or second year at the campus. And it was a very political oriented, and the politics Board of Studies, as it was called at the time, was a theoretical mold, and I was a practical politics person, and so that was a struggle in some ways. All the mandatory courses were about political theory.
What if the Stevenson's core course? What was? Do you have any of the readings from the core course that you remember?
Oh yes, they mailed us before we arrived a letter saying we had to read 2 books before we got there. And one was James Joyce, The Dubliners, and the other was Ludwig Wittgenstein, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which, I don't know what the polite word is, it was tedious. And I remember holding my hands over my ears and reading it a page at a time and trying to understand what it was that was in there. It was a struggle for an 18-year-old kid from Vallejo. And the core course itself, that turned out to be a great thing on one level, which is that was one of the many ways you really got to know your fellow Stevenson students, and it was all 3 quarters, and there were sections, and you got to know the professors of the college and your fellow students, regardless of what the subject matter was. And in my year, my first year, which is 68 to 69, there was a revolt among the students against the core course. I can't remember what form it took. There was either a demonstration or letters, or there was something, because people didn't like how generic it was, and there were, a different professor would come in and give a lecture at every different thing. It was a way to bind together the college, but it meant that there wasn't necessarily much cohesion in the course. And so I remember there was one professor who really took it personally and didn't like it, that the students were revolting. And so the major lectures were given in the Stevenson Dining Hall, now known as the Stevenson Event Center. So this guy was giving a lecture in the Stevenson Dining Hall, very upset that people were protesting the core course. And in the middle of the lecture, it rained so hard on the roof that he had to stop for a second because of the noise. And he actually turned to the students and said, "I can compete against you, but I can't compete against that." It was a good moment.
What of the narrative evaluations? Did you remember it happening at other schools? And at UCSC, was there the option of letter grades?
Oh no, and we were, this was completely, it switched, it was pass-fail, and then during my time as a student it switched to pass-no credit. And you had narrative evaluations if you were in a class that was under a major lecture size. There was some dividing line. So if you're in a small class, you were just guaranteed a narrative evaluation. And some of them were generic, but a lot of them really put time into it. And I took one politics class with a professor that I'm still in touch with, who's long since retired, a Stevenson College professor, who was my faculty advisor, David Thomas. And he wrote in this evaluation that I could afford to be more venturesome. That's what he said. I could afford to be more venturesome. And then after I think I'd been mayor in the legislature, I ran into him somewhere and he said, "You didn't have to take me so seriously." And I wrote different papers for classes and things that they would write about in the narratives. It was really good. I thought it was feedback. You were competing against yourself, not against other people, and you weren't being reduced to a number. We loved that system, and ironically, I was, I think, president-elect of the Alumni Association when the proposal came to the Academic Senate to switch to the letter grade option. And we ran a field campaign against changing it out of the Alumni Association, where we contacted every single faculty member and assigned people they know and really tried to keep them from making the switch because we thought it was unnecessary. And then lo and behold, I taught a class at UCSC in the time between I was in the legislature and appointed by the governor to his cabinet. I taught a class, a senior capstone class in environmental studies. It was on state environmental policy. And I had to write narrative evaluations, and one of the professors gave me the advice that you could put a lot of numbers in the narrative evaluation, and I told them the only number in my evaluations will be the date. There will be no other numbers. And it just harkens back to the tradition of genuinely appraising students on an individual basis, which is what we loved at the time and drew many of us to UCSC.
What of the zeitgeist? What was the feeling at Stevenson? What was the Stevenson identity at your time?
Well, it's funny because I served, I think, 3 out of the 4 years I was at Stevenson on the student council. And it was a very politically active time. But it was a time also of humor and sort of revolution. And the Stevenson Student Council would regularly pass motions that we would get out of Vietnam by 7:45 that night. And we would do lots of things. The minutes from that time, I think, are on file at the library, and they are hilarious. They were written by one of my roommates, and they were just comedy on how people acted. And we had Cowell, we always considered to be the very uppity college, the first one, the staid one, and they were the Cowell Provost Council of 10 or something like that. We were the Stevenson Student Council. We would always write them letters ripping them for how serious they were, not paying attention to some of the issues of the time, and they would write us letters back where we would have them return saying address the unknown, and just have that kind of relationship with Cal. And yet people were politically active. It was the exciting times. It was the Vietnam War. It was the draft that was going on. I remember one time that it was discovered that draft boards had to, by law, respond to any piece of correspondence they got. So all these tables were set up in the Stevenson dining hall, and I think we wrote 10,000 letters to draft boards across California, figuring, well, let's just clog them up. If they legally have to respond to each letter, let's just send them a letter and clog up the system. And it was the Stevenson dining hall that was the center of that effort. And there were many times that that was a place that there would be rallies or things would come out of. And I have to say, part of the Stevenson ethic too is it was a lot of fun. There were all these crazy things. There was one time a water fight shut down the entire upper quad, and of course now I'm in charge of water for the state. People should be conserving it, not having water fights. But somebody had I'm trying to remember the name of what you call a catapult built on the top of, I think it was dorm 4, and they could catapult a water balloon from the top of dorm 4 into the Stevenson circle. And at some point they aimed them all into the quad, and people were just throwing water. Everybody was in the windows in the front of each dorm watching it go on if they didn't catch it. And there was a newspaper at the time. The Stevenson had its own newspaper. It was called the Stevenson Libre. But there was just tells you how long ago it was. It was a mimeograph machine. Just in the basement of one of the dorms, there was paper there, and anybody could publish it. You just had to number it in sequence. You wanted to put out your own Stevenson Libre, you put it out. And that was just a regular publication of the college and really part of college life.
What of the relationship with the provost? The provost now, Alice Yang, has a lot of events at the house, and there's been really mixed reviews of the different provosts. Do you have anything to say about
Well, we
the
all
provost?
really liked the provost at the time. I think the entire, it was FM Glenn Wilson. He was British. Mrs. Wilson was a character. You would get invitations through the year. They would invite every student to the house, and it would just be titled Provost and Mrs. Wilson at home, and then list the hours. And that meant you were to come during that hours that they were at home. And at some time through the year, they invited every student, and it was very British in some ways. And she was active in the college by the fact that her personal project, there was this sort of commuter lounge. It was the room right behind the entrance. It was called the Jolly Room. and she made it her project to turn it into the Stevenson Coffee House. And she worked really hard to do that, and it was opened as a coffee house. In the last days I was a student, I think it was at the end of my senior year, it became the coffee house, which is still there to this day. And that was the provost's wife's project. He went on some kind of leave or sabbatical or something in the middle, and Bruce Rosenblum was acting provost, and he just passed away a year or two ago. And he was in the physics department, and he was really swept up in what was going on with the students and organizing. And I think it was my third year, Nixon and Kissinger mined Haiphong Harbor and bombed Hanoi, and almost every campus in the United States went out on strike for a week or two. And we decided we needed to go to Washington. And so they organized a more official Washington delegation. 6 of us flew, but about 75 people either drove or went on their own. And we were all in Washington lobbying for 10 days or 2 weeks in the middle of the quarter. And Bruce Rosenblum, the provost, I remember, was very active in that activity that sort of got us all there.
The anti-Vietnam.
Yeah, the anti-war stuff that was going on at the time.
What was the response from McHenry and Clark Kerr regarding these protests against Vietnam?
I think Dean McHenry, it was really tough, and Clark Kerr had really been fired by Reagan in the year before I got to the campus, although there was that legendary graduation of the pioneer class. I don't know if anybody's talked about that, but at the time the quarry was the big outdoor amphitheater, and the first 4-year class that went from 65 to 69 was graduating in the quarry, and the students took it over. Clark Kerr was there to give the graduation speech, and because he and Dean McHenry were graduate students together, and they always dreamed of what the perfect college would be. And lo and behold, Clark Kerr is president when Santa Cruz is created, and he appoints Dean McHenry as the first chancellor, and they get to design that dream college that they talked about when they were graduate students. And so it was really meaningful that even though he had been fired a couple of years before, or a few years before, he was invited back to that first graduation, and the students took it over. One speaker declared that for democratic socialism, and then they awarded an honorary doctorate degree in political science to Huey P. Newton, and a professor, he was in prison at the time, so J. Herman Blight came down and accepted it on his behalf, and Clark Kerr was never allowed to give a speech. And one of the great things was Clark Kerr came to the 25th reunion of the pioneer class and gave the speech that he didn't give at the graduation. And so I think it was really tough on Dean McHenry because he really had the vision for the campus. He was really the thing that made it happen. In those early years, it was difficult. You were starting from scratch. You were hiring a new faculty. You were doing new buildings every year. You were deciding how exactly to establish a no-grade campus with residential colleges that really didn't exist in a major way in many places in the United States and the world. And I don't think he expected the Vietnam War and sort of student activism to show up at the same time that he was doing this. And so here he was, dedicated to founding this campus in a profound way. And he just had to run into the headwind of the student organizing, and there was this big move on campus to name one of the colleges after Malcolm X. It's a real organizing thing, and I always remember that there was a huge organizing rally in the Cowell Dining Hall, and one of the professors, and Chancellor McHenry came. He came and he stood in the back, and one of the professors really ripped up the crowd and turned to him and said, "Chancellor, will you be our brother?" And he walked up and took the mic and began by saying, "Well, I'd like to be your brother," and then sort of talked about whatever the reality was of his situation. And I had this interaction that involved Stevenson College and Chancellor McHenry, where I thought he was really, you know, out of touch with the students because of what was going on. And so I wrote him a letter. And I said, you know, there are, I think there were at least 4 colleges. There might have been a 5th by then. But I said, you know, if you ate lunch at a different college every week, you would just be with the students. You would be in touch. Very naive, innocent suggestion. I get a letter back that says something like, well, out of my next 35 lunches, 29 of them are booked, but I happen to be free on this day. And if I were invited to lunch at Stevenson College, I would accept. So I called and invited him to lunch at Stevenson College, and I walked over and met him at the administration building and walked him over. And I was very naive. I had not done any organizing at all. So he and I sat down, and nobody would sit within 2 tables of us. And I'm just sitting there mortified, dying in the middle of the dining hall with the chancellor. Nobody will sit with us. And I'm motioning under the table, come over, come over. And finally, about half or 2/3 of the way through, people came over and talked. But I thought, so much for my brilliant idealistic suggestion. And I got to know Dean McHenry, and when I was a senior, I was a 22-year-old George McGovern delegate to the Democratic National Convention. I organized with other people the caucus to choose delegates in the campaign on the Central Coast. And I always remember he took me aside at an event, and it might have been a graduation event that was at University House. He took me in the side and said, do you have the money to get there? I could help raise the money for you to get to Miami Beach and back. And it had already been raised, but I was very touched that he did that. And actually a little surprised, but I think he was a long time political science professor, not politics like the board at UCSC, and had run for Congress himself in the San Fernando Valley in the 1950s, and just had an appreciation for what it meant to be a delegate to the Democratic National Convention.
What of the relationship? So you were a Stevenson student, a UCSC student, and then you became the mayor. So what was the relationship then, when you were a student, between UCSC and Santa Cruz, and later when you became mayor?
Well, that's a really good question, because I think the town really welcomed the campus. They thought it was going to be an economic boon, and then here comes the Vietnam War era. And there were really fractious town-gown relations, and there was even a time, and I know right what house it is, the minute you turn off of Mission Street on Highland, on the left there's 2 older homes, just right on the left. The first one's on Mission, and one was a student household. And somebody had a Viet Cong flag in the front window of the house. And the mayor of Santa Cruz at the time broke into the house and ripped the flag down. And it was a very controversial thing, but it sort of signaled what was going on between the town and the gown. And so then I was elected to the city council just 9 years after I graduated from UCSC. In 1981, and in 1983 I was elected mayor. And I thought and said openly, I want to bridge the town-gown gap. I think it's time to do that. And then each time I was elected mayor, the voters passed an initiative against UCSC growth at the election just days before I was elected mayor. And the first one, in 1983, the chancellor at the time, Robert Sinsheimer, wanted to build, I'm trying to remember what it was called. It was a technical science center that was in what the city hoped to be its green belt. And it was going to be, have the city have to pay for some of the infrastructure, but get none of the revenue, and the university would get the revenue. So it was a very difficult issue, and the voters passed an initiative that asked that it go through the city's land use process. And so my first act as mayor was to go to the council, draw up a contract, put the voter initiative in the contract, sign it on behalf of the city, and send it to the chancellor and ask him to sign it. And of course he wouldn't, because they didn't want to give up their right to not have to go through city land use. And eventually that was abandoned, but it was just difficult because the growth issues were very difficult. And then when I was mayor the second time, a long-range development plan was done at UCSC that was going to expand the growth, and there was not going to be a lot of mitigation of the infrastructure at the city, and in fact the city was going to pay for a lot of the infrastructure of the growth, which was part of the original contracts, but became really hard after Proposition 13 passed, and cities didn't have the same funding ability that they had at the time those contracts were signed. And we actually sued the university over the long-range development plan, and then worked in a settlement that we eventually signed. It didn't have a lot of teeth, but required annual meetings and a review of the growth targets and laying out the infrastructure. So those are very difficult years, and the irony is that when I got to the legislature in 2002, I worked out a way to try to work through those very growth issues as a legislator and as chair of the budget committee, where we required UC to mitigate every building it built before it got the state money for the next building, to finally sort of address the issue that had been heart of the town-gown relations. And when I was mayor, now the relations are significantly better, because in many ways Santa Cruz has become a company town. The university really dominates the town in terms of the students who works there. It's really not as separate as it was in the early years, which was at the root of some of the discord.
Do you have any other stories that you'd like to share, later in your time as mayor in regards to UCSC, or when you were a student there?
Well, just to tell a few zany stories of being a student. I mean, the great thing about, there were only 600 students at Stevenson when I started, and most of the colleges are double that now. And so you really knew most of the people that you were going to school with, and you really knew most of the professors. I never took a class from Carlos Narenia, but I always remember at our senior dinner, that was a few nights before we graduated, he stood up and he offered a toast, and he toasted everything the faculty didn't know. And I remember we all cheered wildly. And, he was later, I think, even a provost, and he was beloved among the students as a very unique person. And there were, just silly things. One time there was this guy that's still in town. He's a good friend of mine. I will leave him nameless, and he was very proud that he had this new MG convertible, I think it was, and he just brazenly parked it in the quad in front of the dorm. And so a bunch of us loosened the brake and rolled it all the way down into the dining hall. And when he came out and didn't see it parked there, and somebody told him it was in the dining hall, he was so mad because the dining hall was always locked between meals, and he nearly broke the doors down getting in and had to turn his car on and drive out of the dining hall. There was just always lots of practical jokes or things going on as students, because I worked in the dining hall for 3 of the 4 years, and it served both Cowell and Stevenson, and so I would have to go back and forth. And in those days, it was very fixed. I think the students have it good now about food available all the time. You had to hit for the hour that was breakfast, the hour that was lunch, or the hour that was dinner, or you didn't get served food. And I always remember students were so out of it with regard to what was going on in the rest of the world that whenever daylight savings time happened, about 2/3 of the students would miss their dining hour because they never changed their clocks. They weren't reading newspapers. They didn't know that this was happening. And so there were just lots of things like that that were going on. There was also this big prank that was really controversial, where at the time there were completely, dorms were completely separated by gender. So there were 4 dorms that men lived in and 4 doors that women lived in. And there were toilet stalls, and this guy went in and removed all the toilet stall dividers in some of the dorms and stacked them up, and it freaked all these people out. Some of them would lock all 3 doors, and then only one person could use the toilets at the time. It was this big deal. I think he got, in the end, into big trouble over damages of having them being reinstalled and different things. The campus radio station was really primitive at the time, and it was in the basement of dorm 2 in the upper quad at Stevenson College. So there was just, and one of the other things is the regents would periodically meet on campus. And I think it was at the end of my first month as a student, the regents came to UCSC, and Ronald Reagan was governor, and people sat in front of his bus and they demonstrated. And the state schools chief was running for the U.S. Senate, very conservative. And he said Santa Cruz was the cross between a hippie pad and a brothel. And he awarded himself the Purple Heart for student disorder, saying he had been beaten up going into the regents meeting, which was not true. Somebody was arrested, a professor, for wearing a shirt with a U.S. flag on it. And it was, and at those times, the regents included many people that were later high profile. I mean, H.R. Haldeman, who was Nixon's chief of staff, was on the regents. Robert Finch, who was a Nixon protege who became director of Health and Human Services, was on the regents. Catherine Hearst, who was Patty Hearst's mother, was on the regents. I think Dorothy Chandler of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in the LA Times was on the regents. Jess Unruh was speaker. It was just a fascinating time where all these major California figures were on campus. It was one of the last times the regents met on a campus for a number of years. They discontinued them after the tumultuous meeting at UC Santa Cruz.
How do you think that UC Santa Cruz, Stevenson, has affected you in your professional career?
Well, interestingly, I wrote an undergraduate thesis. At the time, if you were a politics student, you had a choice. You could have comprehensive examinations that were oral, where the professors would bark questions at you, generally about political theory, or you could write an undergraduate thesis. So that was no choice for me. I wrote an undergraduate thesis. I was not going to do the comprehensive exams. And so I wrote my thesis on the history of water development in California, having no idea that I was in some way making a career choice at the time. So that in my public career, almost every stage I've been involved in water. I was the point person on the city council on water issues, and as mayor, I did a whole series of bills when I was in the legislature related to water. And now I'm the governor's point person for water